we also really appreciate the fact that we've got to change Santa Clara County. How many people will agree we need to change Santa Clara County? We need good people to run for office. And if you've never thought about running for office, please think. They're coming up in Santa Clara County in the November election alone. There are almost 200 nonpartisan seats. That means you don't run as a Republican or as a Democrat. If they're nonpartisan, they're school boards, town councils, and special districts. If you're interested, go to our website, svwarw.com, find out more information, and essentially contact me, Jan Soule, and I'm happy to talk with anybody who has even the slightest interest in this.
Today is a special treat that we're bringing to you. Our guest is Joshua Philipp. He's an award-winning investigative reporter with the Epoch Times and host of the Crossroads with Joshua Philipp YouTube channel, which I highly recommend. You've got to check this out because he covers the most interesting current events on video for us. And he also has on there a the first full-length documentary titled Tracking Down the Origins of Wuhan Virus, which he put together and has enjoyed over 2 million views so far. And I hear his total is over 8 million views for all of those videos, which is very cool. And we're going to be able to say we knew him when. Josh is an expert on unrestricted warfare, asymmetrical hybrid warfare, interesting stuff, and subversion, which he's going to talk about today. He offers also, with all of that, he blends in historical perspectives on what's going on, which is really interesting. He's done over 10 years of research for us on investigating the Chinese Communist Party, their subversion, and he offers a very interesting, unique insight into the global threat that they pose. He lives in New York with his wife and child, and in his free time, he's a poet and a writer with a deep appreciation for classical literature, folklore, and traditional culture, and he helped found the Society of Classical Poets, which I don't know if you guys have heard about yet. It's kind of interesting. I was looking it up last night. It's a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to reviving traditional poetry, and he has some poetry out there too, which is really cool. Today, he's going to address, does the China owe us or own us, which is the Chinese Communist Party. He's going to address 3 topics for us, along with anything else that we're interested in, because he knows so much about stuff. It's really interesting. First one is, how bad is the CCP infiltration into the U.S.? Like, how are they our neighbors? How close are they? What are their ultimate goals? What are they trying to do here? And then how intertwined is our money, along with anything else that he sees in terms of current events going on. So today, it's my pleasure to introduce Josh Philipp.
I was doing this presentation today on, does China owe us or own us? We're going to take an inside look at Chinese subversion. For those of you not familiar with that term, I'll be explaining it. So let's start off now. Now, we recently saw, we recently saw a case that I think a lot of people are aware of, that on its own may not make a whole lot of sense. I'll go over some of it now. This is Dr. Charles Lieber. He was the chair of Harvard University's Chemistry and Chemical Biology Department. He was charged alongside 2 Chinese nationals for connection with aiding the People's Republic of China. And he also had connections with the Wuhan University of Technology and was tied to the Chinese Communist Party's Thousand Talents program. Now, he was recently charged. He has been charged now, or indicted more directly. And I think a lot of people aren't familiar with the whole picture of what's happening now. So let's go a bit deeper into this. Here's a bit of a bigger picture. Since July, the department has uncovered, this is the Department of Education, has uncovered more than $6 billion in unreported foreign gifts from countries including Qatar, China, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. This includes Harvard and Yale. Yale received at least $375 million in foreign gifts or contracts unreported over the last 4 years. And so let's go a bit deeper into this now. Is that an isolated thing, or is this a larger issue? These are just a handful of cases we've seen recently. U.S. lawmakers target Confucius Institutes in schools. We'll be going over what the Confucius Institutes are. Chinese PLA members, 54th Research Institute, are now on the most wanted list of the FBI. Now, everyone may remember when, under the Obama administration, they indicted these different Chinese military hackers. I'll explain something kind of interesting on that. Those hackers were with Unit 61398 of the General Staff Department, 3rd Department. A lot of people don't know the significance of that. The General Staff Department is the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military. The 3rd Department is their signals intelligence branch. There are about 22 known operational bureaus under it. Why is the war-fighting branch of the Chinese military running cyber operations to steal U.S. intellectual property? I think that's something we should look into, right? Why is the war-fighting branch of a foreign government launching cyber attacks against private U.S. companies to steal intellectual property for economic gain? That is a military operation. The recent one, 54 Research Institute, these individuals were indicted under the Trump administration more recently. 54 Research Institute is actually different, and this actually shines a light on something totally different. These guys are with the 4th Department. That's the Electronics Intelligence Department. And they were stealing personal information on American citizens, not things they were using for financial gain. And so why was the Electronic Warfare Department under the Chinese Communist Party's war-fighting department again, stealing personal information on Americans? We'll be talking about that. China's funding of U.S. researchers, right? We're talking about the Chinese intelligence operation called Subnational Cooperation. Chinese telecommunications companies charged, you might have heard of Huawei, so on. We'll be looking into all of these. So I think there's a bigger picture taking place. And we all see different cases of this coming up. What I hope to do with this presentation is help bring it all together, help everyone understand all this noise we're seeing, what is really taking place right now. How do these all interrelate? Now, this is an article from 2018. So people might have missed it. A whole of society threat. I'll read a couple quotes here. FBI director said, quote, "One of the things we're trying to do is view the China threat as not just a whole of government threat, but a whole of society threat on their end. I think it's going to take a whole of society response by us." He said these collectors, what the intelligence community calls people who collect intelligence on behalf of agencies or governments, had infiltrated U.S. universities. And so he was talking about this even before we saw these recent cases. He continues, "I think in the setting, I would just say that the use of non-traditional collectors, especially in the academic setting, whether it's professors, scientists, students, which we're seeing right now. We're seeing, for example, professors like Charles Lieber getting called out. We saw these 54, I believe it was, different scientists under NIH either forced to be, they were either fired or forced to step down because of their connections to the Chinese Communist Party. That was just a few weeks ago. And also student groups, Chinese student groups. I'll be going into what the Chinese Student and Scholar Association is, and different organizations that the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, uses to extend its influence into American college campuses, and even uses these institutions to pressure and to threaten Chinese students who are not part of this thing at all, to threaten their families, attack them if they try to step out. For example, they talk about human rights abuses in China, like the abuse of house Christians. They can have their families threatened by these student groups operating openly on American soil. I'll be explaining some of that. And also some ongoing investigations. Now, here's a few quotes. "The leadership of the Justice Department has put a bullseye on the Chinese government." This is from actually a bit ago. I can't remember the year. I think it was a couple years ago. "The work involves investigations into American academics and work with U.S. universities. And the department officials say their nationwide undertaking isn't slowing down." An interview with Politico, John Demers, the Justice Department's Assistant Attorney General for National Security, said DOJ headquarters wants each of the country's 94 U.S. attorney districts to bring cases as part of their work. And so based on this, again, a whole of society threat from China, whole of society threat called out by the FBI, and the Justice Department stating that they're having every U.S. attorney district bringing cases against issues of Chinese espionage in the United States. So suddenly the noise we're seeing right now, the different cases we're seeing right now, starting to come together, right? Now let's go into what subversion is. I'll be explaining now a bit of how these things work. So this is from 2015. This is the Countering Espionage. It was the National Counterintelligence and Security Center National Counterintelligence Strategy for 2020 to 2022 in the US. It says here, Russia and China operate globally, use all instruments of national power to target the United States, and have a broad range of sophisticated intelligence capabilities. And it continues, quote, threat actors are using these capabilities against an expanded set of targets and vulnerabilities. Foreign intelligence entities are targeting most U.S. government departments and agencies, even those without a national security mission, as well as national laboratories. Sound familiar? The financial sector, the U.S. industrial base, and other private sectors and academic entities. So what do we have here? This is the National Counterintelligence and Security Center on their strategy for the United States between 2020 and 2022. It last updated 2015. And so what are we seeing here? Again, the US government has shifted its focus to rooting out Chinese espionage and subversion activities in the United States. And again, bringing, I think, more context to the different cases we're seeing now. And as we see here now, it's not just they're targeting government. They're not just doing this for espionage or intelligence gathering. They're targeting different government branches that aren't even involved in international missions. National laboratories. Why are they targeting our national laboratories? Why are they targeting our financial sector? Why the U.S. industrial base, our economy? Why the private sector, and why academic entities? In other words, this was all known, already being called out, and already investigated. So very likely we're going to be seeing more and more cases on this, I think, based on this. Now, what is China's non-traditional espionage? This is from the FBI in 2018. It says, quote, these talent recruitment and brain gain programs, as some in China call them, also encourage theft of intellectual property from U.S. institutions. For example, China's talent recruitment plans, such as the 1,000 Talents program. Remember, Dr. Charles Lieber is being accused of being part of the 1,000 Talents programs. Offer competitive salaries, state-of-the-art research facilities, and honorific titles, luring both Chinese overseas talent and foreign experts alike to bring their knowledge and experience to China, even if that means stealing proprietary information or violating export controls to do so. So what does it mean? Stealing proprietary information or violating export controls. Espionage, again. And what is non-traditional espionage? Unofficial spies recruited through a spy branch of a foreign government using the open system of the United States and the international legal system to gain information from that country that is valuable, that the Chinese Communist Party is targeting for whatever reason. So moving on. Now, one interesting thing to explain is how do we understand the nature of the Chinese Communist Party's use of espionage? Now, in the West, the motivations for engaging in espionage would go under the acronym of M.I.C.E. Money, ideology, creed, or ego, right? You're doing it because you want to make money. You're doing it because maybe you're ideologically aligned, maybe Republican or Democrat, and you want to act against the opposite party. Maybe it's a belief of some kind. We talk about creed, right? Maybe it's a rival religious dispute. People might be engaged in that, and they'll want to expose an opposite camp. And there's also ego, that you're doing it for your own, egotistical motivations. In the West, that is how we would define the motivations for espionage. Under the Chinese Communist Party, it's different. They play a devil's advocate approach. They look for moral flaws. They want to exploit moral weaknesses. And so their main ones are lust, power, fame, and greed. For example, businessmen now I'll go over some of the ways they bring these individuals to China. You might get offered a speaking event if you're an academic. You might get offered a business opportunity if you're a businessman. You might get offered a tour of China and possible sister programs with China if you're a government official, and they target all of them. Anyone of even moderate, moderate prominence, you are going to be approached by these individuals. You are going to have them try to exploit you. In New York, for example, I've had local city council members saying that every one of them gets approached like this. So what is it? Lust. They have what they call honey traps. So you might go to China, you might, have a nice party, and afterwards you might meet a young girl or young boy, and they will have video cameras set up oftentimes in the hotel rooms. They call this honey traps. Sometimes it's a relationship, maybe even a marriage. There have been cases of this. There was an individual, for example, he was a contractor working for the US military. He was stationed in Hawaii, and he had a Chinese girlfriend. And he was charged later because that Chinese girlfriend just had an odd fascination with American nuclear secrets, which he openly and very often provided her with. An example of a honey trap. We talk about power, right? Individuals who want more influence. The Chinese Communist Party runs large-scale networks in the United States through its United Front Work Department. I'll be explaining this. And it gets into the systems that they control within different Chinatowns, even some of the retirement homes. If you want power, this entire body will back you as you try to advance through the U.S. political system. Actually, a lot of my early reporting around 2008 to 2012, I exposed a lot of this taking place in New York, including some of the key politicians who were being, at least we could say, propped up by these factions. There's fame. You find this a lot with academics. Now imagine you're a well-meaning U.S. academic. You pour your heart and soul into your research. You write this 300-page research document, and nobody reads it, because who's going to read a 300-page research document? They do it all the time. They feel a lot of pride in their work, and a lot of people don't read it. Then suddenly you get an invitation from China. You go there, they literally roll out a red carpet for you to go speak at an event. And when you're there, you're surrounded by Chinese students who appear extremely interested in every word you're saying. And then afterward, they ask you questions like, "You're so smart. Why is it that America, is so intolerant of China? Why does America fear the rise of China? You're so tolerant. Why are more Americans not like you?" They will feed these seeds of ideas into their heads, and over time work on gaining more and more control over them by propping up their internal image, by hitting on their ego, their desire for fame, and feeding that in order to exploit them over time. And there's also greed. You might, for example, one of the main ways the Chinese Communist Party launders money in New York. I've done a lot of research on this as well. A former Chinese spy told me about this, for example. Let's say that you run a business, or they want to launder money to you. They'll tell you to establish an import-export business. Now, on the American books, they can charge you $1 million, but when it comes to the deal itself, maybe on the Chinese side, they only charge you $500,000 for a large import of goods. They have, in a way, paid you $500,000. And they will use that, these deals, for example, on the Chinese side, giving you discounts on the Chinese side as a way of paying you off. It's a form of payment that cannot really be traced on the U.S. side. And it's a form of, bribery that is very hard to prosecute on the U.S. side. They do things like this on a large scale. Moving on, let's look at some of the different tools they use. Now, on here, I have an actual screenshot of the Chinese Consulate General of the People's Republic of China in New York. This is a screenshot of their New York website. And let's look over the different branches they have here. Listed directly on their website, the United Front Work Department of the CPC Central Committee. The United Front is one of the Chinese Communist Party's main overt espionage departments. This is a branch that they use to target U.S. government officials. This is the branch they use to control Chinese communities. This is the branch where if you're a Chinese dissident living in the United States on U.S. soil, these people will threaten you. They will threaten your families. I had a woman tell me that she was Taiwanese. She said that she was told they could make her disappear. And they work with groups like the Triads, the Chinese Mafia, human traffickers, drug smugglers, you name it, operating on American soil, openly. It's listed on the Chinese consulate website. They have the International Liaison Department of the CPC Central Committee. What is that? Project 2049 Institute. It's a think tank. They actually had a great report on this. Now, we all heard this story about Russian disinformation, Russia trying to interfere with our elections. The Chinese Communist Party has an entire military branch openly dedicated to political warfare. It's called the General Political Department. And one of the branches it runs is the liaison department. It is a department dedicated to trying to influence foreign politics, to waging political warfare on foreign countries. And here on the New York website of the Chinese consulate, it is listed openly. Now let's go into a bit of other parts of this. Chinese student and scholar associations. The different Chinese consulates, including in New York, openly provide funding to and direction to Chinese student and scholar associations, which operate at just about every U.S. university, large and small. So, in other words, Chinese student groups funded by and directed by the Chinese consulates. And these are the individuals who, if you try to say, for example, host an event talking about human rights abuses in China, they will go out and they will protest. They will try to block the event from taking place. If Chinese students are involved, these individuals will find the identities of the Chinese students and report on them back in China so that their families will be threatened, even if they're on American soil. Their families will be threatened because of these networks. And if they try to return to China, they themselves might face retribution for it. There have been cases of this. For example, SDSU in San Diego State University, they were hosting the Dalai Lama, and there was a large outcry of Chinese students saying, don't host him. You know, it's offensive to the Chinese people. This is racist, all this stuff. Turns out those students were part of the local Chinese Student and Scholar Association, and they actually published a document stating that their connections to the Chinese Communist Party. They were being directed to do that by the Chinese Communist Party. There are Confucius Institutes. And what are Confucius Institutes? Now, notably, they're just now being called out in the U.S. In Canada, they've already been on a large scale, basically rooted out of the schools. In Sweden, they just removed the last one. In Australia, these different things are part of the mainstream discussion. In America, people are just starting to wake up to it. So it's not, this isn't an America thing. Every country just about deals with this. And America is really just starting to wake up to it. There's a great documentary on the Confucius Institutes called In the Name of Confucius, if anyone wants more information on this. But let me explain a bit what it is now. These are Chinese language and culture programs that the Chinese Communist Party itself hosts at different universities and schools. It's not just colleges, it's also high schools and things like that. If your high school has a Chinese language and culture program, look into who's running it, because sometimes it is part of the Confucius Institute. Now, what are they and why are they problematic? The Chinese Communist Party will pay universities to let them teach programs at their schools. They will give them money to let them run these programs. Now, why would they do that? It's because the history they're teaching is not real Chinese history. They're teaching them the Chinese Communist Party's narrative on Chinese history. And so they're using this as a form of soft power. They're promoting the Chinese Communist Party's worldview to the individuals who very likely will move on to become the sinologists, the people who study China, the Americans who know how to speak China, the Americans who might go into things like the CIA, who might go into the FBI, who might go on to become the leading American academics when it comes to understanding China. They are subverting that process so that individuals who speak Chinese on American soil, individuals that become the China experts on American soil, are the ones promoting and indoctrinated with the Chinese Communist Party's worldview. This is a form of soft power. What are the Tongs? Now, this ties again into the United Front Work Department. Tongs are not all bad. Let me explain a bit of this. Traditional Chinese culture, before the Chinese Communist Party, the government typically did not stretch below the county level. And below the county level, they had a bottom-up system of government. These were family organizations. They were fraternal organizations, kind of like guilds. They were hometown associations. And so these different bottom-up form of communal government that they had. When Chinese people immigrated to different countries, they maintained that same bottom-up system of government. And these organizations they have for this are called Tongs. This is the reason why Chinese communities, Chinatowns, are so much different from other immigrant communities in the United States and around the world. You have Chinatowns in just about every major city. It's because they are mostly self-governed by the Tongs. Some of them have tens of thousands of members. Some claim to have hundreds of thousands of members. The Chinese Communist Party, understanding that the Tongs are basically the unofficial governing branches of overseas Chinese communities, will target them through influence campaigns under the United Front Work Department and the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office. They have two different parts to it. They will target them to try to win over their support for the Chinese Communist Party. And once they get into them, they gain control of their entire networks. And so, for example, if you need a favor, you have a cousin who wants to get into business, you go to the Tongs. If you have an individual in China who you want to smuggle to the US, then they go to the Tongs too. That's where the triads come in. Underneath a lot of Tongs are what you call the triads, the Chinese mafia. Let me give an example. In New York City, one of the groups I was investigating and did a lot to expose was the Fujian American Association, which is one of the main Chinese Communist Party affiliated Tongs in New York. Other ones, Shandong Association, Peking Association, several of them. Under the Fujian American Association is the Fuqing Gang. They are one of the largest transnational organized crime groups in the world, one of the largest mafias in the world, operating openly in New York City. They were the group, you might remember the Golden Venture. It was a human trafficking ship that ran aground off the course of New York when the water, it was happened during winter, I believe. A lot of people on board ended up dying. It was a huge scandal. The Tongs were behind the Chinatown bus wars when you had individuals shooting up Chinese restaurants, with Uzis and things like that. Killing each other in pretty brutal ways. Finally, the city had to step in and put an end to it. Different things like that. These organizations still operate openly in New York. They are openly engaged in prostitution, human trafficking, drug smuggling, counterfeit operations. You name it, they're involved in it. Now, again, operating openly in the U.S. under the Fujian American Association, at least in New York, knowingly, to the knowledge of even local officials. The Tong, for example, will try to write off responsibility by saying, oh, well, how can we control who comes to our meetings? And at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party has direct influence over them through their control of the Tongs. And so the Chinese Communist Party is able to influence not just the legitimate society, not just the legitimate economy, but also the illegitimate economy, the smuggling channels, the drug operations, you name it. I'll go into a bit of why that's important as well. There are other things, Committee of 100, China centers. We'll be going over this a bit more as I go forward. Now, a bit more on the United Front. This is from a report from the U.S. China Economic and Security Review Commission from 2018. It says, quote, to carry out its influence activities abroad, the UFWD, United Front Work Department, directs overseas Chinese work, which seeks to co-opt ethnic Chinese individuals and communities living outside China, while a number of other key affiliated organizations guided by China's broader United Front strategy conduct influence operations targeting foreign actors and states. And it lists some of these organizations. The Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, China Association for International Friendly Contact, Chinese Student and Scholar Associations. Sound familiar? And also the Confucius Institutes, part of the United Front work of the Chinese Communist Party. Operating openly, when you get to the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations and the Confucius Institutes, operating openly at most major U.S. universities. And so again, this is overt espionage happening in plain, bright daylight. Everybody sees it. It is able to take place mainly because nobody is sounding an alarm over it. Nobody's calling them out for it. Bit more on this. Funding of U.S. academic and policy discourse. Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies received funding tied to the China-United States Exchange Foundation, registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act. Johns Hopkins received money from this organization. And what is this organization? According to Foreign Policy, CUSEF's partnership with the Johns Hopkins SAIS is not its first with U.S. academic institutes and think tanks, as it has also cooperated with the Brookings Institution, CSIS, Atlantic Council, Center for American Progress, East-West Institute, Carter Center, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, all of which are influential in U.S. foreign policy. one of the Chinese Communist Party's known front groups, openly providing funding to major U.S. institutions involved in U.S. policy. Based on information we've gone over, you understand the significance of that, right? Now, a deeper look at this. I'm just looking at a couple of them here. The Ministry of State Security. Now, the Ministry of State Security is kind of like a combination of the FBI and the CIA, and also the State Council's National Science Foundation of China. State Council is the technical government of China, separate technically from the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, but still under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. When the Chinese Communist Party wanted to create this illusion of opening up, of becoming a free market country, they created the State Council and took all the military businesses, which pretty much every business in China was under the military. Before that, that was in the, I think, late 80s under Deng Xiaoping, right around the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre. They took those companies and put them under the State Council. The State Council appeared to be a, say, free market system. You know, it was a free country, still maintaining the controls of the Chinese Communist Party, and basically ran state-run companies under the guise of capitalism. It's basically what they did. I won't go over all of this, but I wanted to show this to emphasize some of these organizations directly involved in overseas operations being run, one, by the Chinese intelligence branch under the Ministry of State Security, again, like their CIA crossed with the FBI, openly operating in different countries. We explain some of these now. National Basic Research Program, 973 program, National High-Tech Research and Development Program, 863 program, 973 program and 863 program, or Project 863. These are two of the Chinese Communist Party's main programs for directing foreign economic espionage. These are branches dedicated, or programs dedicated, to the theft of American intellectual property, operating openly under two at least branches, programs that are operating openly on American soil. The EU-China SME Energy Conservation and Emissions Reduction Research Collaboration Fund, National Key Technologies R&D Program. I'll read a few of these. National S&T Major Projects, Next Generation of Broadband Wireless Mobile Networks, National New Products Program, National Soft Science Research Program. Every single one of these programs is going to target a different segment of foreign communities, all of which, oftentimes unbeknownst to the person signing on to it, unbeknownst to the business or the academic or the individual, saying, "Oh, hey, I got this great program. I got a grant program from this Chinese branch, and they're really interested in working with us." Very likely not fully aware that it's being directed by the Ministry of State Security, that they themselves have been recruited under a Chinese program of espionage. And you can understand, seeing this, just a small picture of it, how easy it is for an individual like these different scientists we're seeing, like these different academics we're seeing, who have been subverted, who have been targeted by a Chinese Communist Party espionage program and have been compromised, and very likely can go to prison for some of the operations they've been part of, very likely at first against their knowledge. State Council, just a few of these. Joint Funds Program, astronomy, civil aviation, iron and steel research, large-scale scientific facilities, Joint Fund of Coal, Joint Research Fund of Overseas Chinese Scholars, and Scholars in Hong Kong and Macau. Again, Young Science Fund, Young Scientists Fund. Programs that will target individuals at just about every level of society and just about every single, say, economic sector. Very likely could be compromised, never fully realizing that they've been compromised, that they've been recruited in some ways to engage in one of the Chinese Communist Party's systems of overt espionage. You can start seeing how easy it is to be compromised by this, and how large scale some of these programs are. And this is, again, just a small picture of what I could be showing you. Now, what is this group? The Committee of 100. They operate openly. This is actually a screenshot of their website. Looks like a friendly group of Chinese individuals who are just interested in promoting their culture, right? Let me explain it. What is the Committee of 100? This is an Epoch Times article. Trevor Loudon, he's one of our contributing authors. He does great reporting on not just Chinese Communist Party, but communist subversive movements in the United States overall. couple quotes from this. In particular, the Committee of 100 and many other friendly groups and individuals have made untiring efforts over the years to promote friendly relations and cooperation between the two countries and brought their relationships this far. That is a quote from Xi Jinping, head of the Chinese Communist Party, in 2015. Now, a bit more on this. By the end of 1990, C100, Committee of 100 founders Pei, Yo-Yo Ma, Shirley Young, Oscar Tong, Henry Tong, and Qian Xiang Wu have recruited nearly 100 American citizens of Chinese descent who had reached the pinnacle of their fields, spanning the arts, business, academia, public service, science, and technology. That's a quote from their actual newsletter. So in other words, this is a group that targets the top level of Chinese influentials in the United States, compromises them to some extent, and gets them to, at the very least, begin acting on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party on American soil. These are the groups that will reach the high-end parts of American society. They will get into, say, political conferences. They'll get into, say, top-level business conferences. And through these different networks, sometimes even American citizens would be part of this, who are just of Chinese descent, begin pushing the Chinese Communist Party's agendas within the influential communities that they're able to gain access to. Again, operating openly in the United States and operating legally in the United States. Now, who controls our institutions? I won't go over all of this, but you can see the logos we have here. This is an infographic the Epoch Times put together. Let me get a drink real quick. Now, we've all heard of the influence of the Chinese Communist Party over the WHO, over the United Nations Human Rights Council, over the different institutions that basically work as the international governing body that directs, although not say surface level politics, but directs to some extent the policies adopted by, say, big businesses, policies adopted by academic institutions in the U.S. A lot of American institutions follow their own, international legal standards. They're transnational businesses a lot of times. And so when they promote issues, when you have academic institutions, when you have things like Common Core, they will oftentimes look to United Nations programs for guidance. Who controls these different international institutions that are providing guidelines for policy in different countries around the world? Every single organization here, every single logo you see, has a Chinese Communist Party member or one of their top-level officials or former top-level officials in one of their leadership roles. Just to paint a, say, broad picture of what's taking place right now. Now, when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party, they have a saying for this. It's strangle you with your own systems. You say you believe in free speech, they will create these state-run media on your own soil, using your own laws, using your own systems, maybe even using citizens of your own country to criticize you, to attack your values, to promote narratives that say, downgrade your own political system and promote the interests of a foreign government on your soil. They do this on a large scale. You say you believe in, say, human rights. Well, they'll create human rights organizations. They'll subvert groups like the United Nations Human Rights Council to make it serve the opposite function. The Epoch Times actually had an exclusive story by a contributor named Alex Newman, and he noted a case at the Human Rights Council of the United Nations that they had a delegation of different Chinese individuals who were persecuted in China, and they were going to come to the United Nations to testify about their cases. The United Nations took their list of names and provided it to the CCP. The individuals were arrested by the Chinese Communist Party. Some of them were, taken in by the Chinese Communist Party, detained temporarily. One of them was killed. One of them died in custody. Again, the United Nations took that list of individuals who were trying to come to them to reveal the ways they have been facing persecution in China, and they provided that list to the institution, the Chinese Communist Party, that was carrying out the abuses, and they were arrested and one of them died. Now, not only that, but the individual who sounded the alarm at the United Nations was punished for being a whistleblower. She was punished by the United Nations. We had an exclusive story explaining that. And this is not an isolated case. You see this in a lot of different instances. And so when it comes to top-level guidance from some of these international governing bodies, we oftentimes automatically assume some kind of, image of the idea that maybe they're acting on separate interests not attached to any specific government. Don't take into account the fact that many of them are directed or controlled directly under individuals who are part of the Chinese Communist Party systems and who can be punished if they deviate from directives of the Chinese Communist Party. Moving on, Enticing, Unwitting Spies. Great book here. It's a research paper, Chinese Industrial Espionage. A couple different things it discusses here. It talks about the Torch program to build high-tech commercial industries, the 973 program for research, the 211 program for reforming universities, along with countless programs for attracting Western-trained scholars back to China. Each of these programs looks to foreign collaboration and technologies to cover key gaps. Now, you might recognize one of the names here, the 973 program. We saw in a previous slide, 973 program is under the Chinese Communist Party's Ministry of State Security. And this is operating openly as a branch meant for economic theft. Not only that, but for recruiting Chinese spies, attracting Western-trained scholars back to China, and for collaboration and covering key gaps of the CCP. It says here, it encourages Western-trained experts to help the Chinese regime's technological development by returning to China or serving in place. What does it mean to serve in place, right? By provided needed information gained while working for their Western employers. So an individual working for your company on American soil, an individual working in your institution, whether it be a government branch or say, international government branch, serving in place while working for their Western employers, serving in place on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. Sound familiar? Well, that's what Dr. Charles Lieber is now being accused of, just as one example. Now, what are we looking at here on a bigger perspective? This goes into unconventional warfare. I mentioned before political warfare, the General Political Department and its liaison department. I mentioned also this report, Project 2049 Institute, talking about this. It's actually back from 2013, before anybody was talking about foreign influence in elections. It says here, quote, political warfare employs strategic psychological operations as a means of leading international discourse and influencing policies of friends and foes alike. Propaganda carried out both during peacetime and in armed conflict amplifies or attenuates the political effects of the military instruments of national power. Among all the CCP communities, GPD, General Political Department, Liaison Department, LD, appears most closely aligned with the United Front system. Now again, United Front, Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, Confucius Institutes, etc. Again, GPD, General Political Department, Liaison Department, aligned with the United Front system. We saw operating openly in New York City, the Chinese consulate having this even listed on their website. And again, we see the United Front, again, tied to political warfare operations, tied to the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations and Confucius Institutes operating openly in American schools. Operating openly, tied to this operation, tied to this program, tied to a military branch of the Chinese Communist Party. Moving on. Going into a bit of war by other means. When we talk about propaganda, when we talk about the broader interests of the Chinese Communist Party, or what we see here, let me step back. It says here, influencing campaigns, propaganda, leading international discourse, right? What does this actually mean? Going into the Chinese military's guidelines on this. This is where we get into the three warfares. Now, the three warfares were approved. This is San Jiang Fan. You have to forgive my Chinese pronunciations. It was approved by the Central Military Commission in 2003 to run PLA information operations. People's Liberation Army, the official military of the Chinese Communist Party. PLA is different from the American military. The American military is sworn to protect the Constitution. The PLA is a party military. They are the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. they're a party military. Imagine, for example, if the Democrat Party or the Republican Party had its own military branch. That would be the PLA, essentially. As at the operational level, the three warfares became the responsibility for the PLA's General Political Department, Liaison Department, which conducts diverse political, financial, military, and intelligence operations. So again, this warfare department, this warfare program, adopted into the PLA in 2003, runs its operations through the General Political Department's Liaison Department. Again, running, which is again connected to our schools, which is again connected to the Confucius Institutes, Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, and the United Front, operating openly in American universities, American schools, operating openly in American, Chinese communities, targeting different members of the, not just Chinese communities, but American influential systems overall. The Chinese Communist Party's political warfare system adopted into their doctrine in 2003. And let me go over this. So what is the three warfares? It's media warfare, legal warfare, and I actually don't have the last one here. It's media warfare, legal warfare, and psychological warfare. I repeated media warfare twice on the list. Apologize for that. And what are these? Psychological warfare is not necessarily lying to you. Psychological warfare is altering the way you interpret. Sorry, let me get a drink. Let me explain this differently. Now, we've all probably heard by now the issue of Russian disinformation. It's one of the main narratives we heard during the Trump, Trump-Russia investigations post and pre-2016. When you talk about disinformation, propaganda, and misinformation, they're actually very different. Propaganda is not necessarily true or false. Propaganda is just imagery meant to elicit an emotional response. It's like a Pavlov's dog type thing where you want the dog to salivate at the sound of a bell. Using propaganda, you can condition people to react emotionally to set stimuli. A political narrative, an individual could become a stimuli through emotional agitation that will elicit an emotional response. Media, for example, could keep telling you that, say, MAGA hats are symbols of hate. And so as they agitate you to believe that a Make America Great Again hat is a symbol of hate, the individual will feel the same revulsion they feel towards like the KKK or hatred every time they see the stimuli of that hat. Just like a dog being trained to, salivate at the sound of a bell. Just like Pavlov's dog, experiments went. It's the same exact principle. That's what propaganda warfare would be. Misinformation is not necessarily the use of true or false. It's not necessarily propaganda. It is just the outright use of false information, misinformation. And this is used strategically, for example, to, say, sow chaos within legitimate movements. For example, if there was an investigation taking place, they might intentionally seed false information into the trail of the investigator to send them down, let's say, bottomless pits or, empty things that will yield no accurate findings or results. It can also be used to divide a community where you start seeding them with false rumors. Some individuals start believing it, become more, agitated over it, and they'll, conflicts will start up within the community. The people who know the real story will say that's false. The people who, have been fed the false information might say, how dare you call it false? And, they'll use it to break up movements and things like that. Disinformation is different. Disinformation can be the use of, say, front organizations. It can be the use of, say, controlled academic institutions. It can be the use of, say, fake events. The Chinese Communist Party does this pretty often, staged events. It can be the use of, for example, when the Soviet Union was doing it in the United States, creating false reports and feeding those false reports through front organizations. So let's say an academic institution that appears to be very credible, that has done credible work in the past, getting a directive suddenly from their foreign operators saying, put out a report making this claim. They will write the report saying that. They will seed it to the different, say, influential media in the US, and very likely they'll report it. If they can get it to report it, then government officials begin reacting to it. Once government officials react to it, you have protests start up, you have different individuals getting unhappy, And over time, the disinformation operation will start to take a life of its own within within the system of political discourse in that country. Disinformation is a tool for, endless means, and it includes many different strategies. Psychological warfare ties into all of these to an extent. Psychological warfare is a way of altering the conclusions people will come to when viewing information. It is altering the way you interpret reality. It can also be called worldview warfare. So, for example, Confucius Institutes operating on American soil will feed American students the narratives of the Chinese Communist Party used to justify the totalitarian rule of the Communist Party and to excuse its bloody history and even its current human rights abuses. Under Mao Zedong alone, between 50 million and 70 million Chinese people killed. Currently, 100 million Christians in China persecuted. 100 million Falun Gong practitioners in China persecuted. Torture, live organ harvesting, re-education through labor, you name it. Muslim Uyghurs being used as slave labor. Tibetan Buddhists having their temples burned down, so on. They will feed you narratives to excuse these kinds of abuses. For example, that would be a psychological warfare operation. Media warfare is the control of different outlets of information. It can also be the use of outlets of information. China calls it borrowed boats, right? Borrowed boat strategy. For example, China Daily, one of the Chinese Communist Party's main state-run news outlets operating in the U.S., was paying major U.S. news outlets money, right, paying them actual cash, to run its China Watch inserts, paid Chinese propaganda in American media. Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, many of them actually were exposed for publishing these just recently. And then also legal warfare, the manipulation of international legal systems. This is how they operate. And again, part of the PLA's, People Liberation Army, Chinese military's General Political Liaison Department, which again runs things like Confucius Institutes, which again runs things like the Chinese Student and Scholar Associations, and which again operate openly on American soil. Going on to a few other parts of this. Let me give an example of how these things play out, because we actually saw the three warfares applied in the U.S., in the South China Sea. And so let me explain how that whole thing worked. Now, you all know the story of the South China Sea. The Chinese Communist Party began moving into the South China Sea, claiming it had historical ownership over the region. It established its 9-dash line, claiming owner. You can actually see it in this image, those green lines, which drew the borders of the Chinese Communist Party around the entire South China Sea and even now wrap around Taiwan, which is a separate country by many, according to many individuals. Self-governing Chinese Communist Party claims ownership over it. Now, when it came to that, here's what the Chinese Communist Party did. Here's how they avoided this, say, hostile takeover of foreign territory. This is how they excused it, how they validated it. They used a psychological warfare narrative, first off, which was the narrative of historical ownership and the establishment of the 9-dash line. They said, we have historical ownership of this region. It was unjustly taken from us. Then they ran a media warfare campaign. Internal censorship, state-run news, foreign statements, government officials, use of pressure on people who said otherwise. So if a news outlet said something otherwise, they would say, that is racist, that is offensive, you better publish a correction. And then they used legal warfare. They locked the battle in the international court system rather than on the battlefield. And so it became a battle of narrative. It became a battle of international law rather than a diplomatic or military battle. And what was the result? The ideological and legal smokescreens were used to keep these operations from entering the realm of open conflict. And also at the same time, the Chinese Communist Party was actually found by the international courts to have, not have legal ownership over that territory. What did they say? They said, well, we're not going to recognize it because according to Chinese law, we have legal ownership over it. And if you want to debate us, come to China and come to our courts and debate us there. And so that's just an example of how three warfares works. Now let's look at subversion on a broader scale. Some different headlines here, many of them recent. You're on file, exclusive inside story on China's database on Americans. I mentioned before the 54 Research Institute, this Chinese military branch stealing personal information on American citizens. Well, actually, I published an exclusive story several years ago, which has since been actually proven true, that the Chinese Communist Party has a database on American citizens. Now, they have the same thing on Chinese citizens. They call it the social credit system, which monitors every single contact you have, every purchase you make online. It monitors your, say, ideology, and it assigns you a citizen score based on your daily activities, based on every activity you have. Your citizen score determines your freedom or oppression in that society. It's come out now, the Chinese Communist Party has similar databases on American politicians. Came out that every governor in the United States has a file on them in China, which includes estimates on how, whether they're friendly or hostile to the Chinese Communist Party. Again here, Sweden closes its last remaining Confucius Institute amid strained relations with China. China is fueling a drug war against the US. Where does fentanyl come from? It comes from China. Where do these synthetic drugs come from? They come from China. Where do the cartels in Latin America get their chemicals from to create many of the drugs heading into the United States, including, for example, methamphetamine? They come from China. For example, there was a recent story, matter of fact, saying that some of the drug cartels in Latin America cannot currently manufacture their drugs. They're having trouble providing enough drugs because the factory they were getting their chemicals from is based in Wuhan, China, the epicenter of the virus. More stories on this. Sri Lanka wants to undo deal to lease support to China for 99 years. It's part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. The Chinese Communist Party's program or vehicle to get foreign countries into debt traps. Once they default on the debts, the Chinese Communist Party takes over the local infrastructure. In Sri Lanka, for example, they were warning about this. One of the politicians there was saying, we're going to look back 20 years from now and find ourselves a vassal state of the Chinese Communist Party. That they're going to become a vassal state of the Chinese Communist Party. They're doing this all over the place. Latin America, Africa, very heavily. Parts of Asia, very heavily. They're also trying now to get into Europe and the United States. Another story, Chinese police to patrol in Italy. Pioneering experiment. There are Chinese police operating on Italian soil. China's Belt and Road Initiative, why the price is too high. Again, talking about the debt traps. Darwin, Australia adopts China's tech for total social control. Part of the One Belt, One Road Initiative, when the Chinese Communist Party goes into these countries and builds critical infrastructure, Huawei being one of the main companies involved in this, they don't just build the infrastructure. They build all of the systems to allow for a reproduction of the Chinese Communist Party's systems of high-tech totalitarianism, including its social credit system. In other words, these high-tech programs for, or beyond Orwell social control, they are building in other countries. There are places in Latin America that already have this. There are places in Africa that already have this. And Darwin, Australia, a Western country, already has it, at least to an extent. And so what's the bigger picture of this when it comes to that? The Chinese Communist Party views the international battle as a battle of, say, international systems. They talk about the US model, the Pax Americana. They talk about the China model and the Pax Sinica, right? Peace under America, peace under China. They want to replace the United States as the world leader. And part of that entails exporting their own system of government to other countries. The One Belt, One Road Initiative is part of that. And their different infrastructure projects are part of that. So what's really going on here? This is the big picture. So Unrestricted Warfare. This is a document from 1999 by two Chinese colonels at the time. One of them went on to become a general. Another one also went up in rank and went on to become a big business owner, I believe, in China. This is taken by many individuals who watch the issues of Chinese military threats as being basically the go-to document for understanding the narratives behind everything we're seeing on the surface. All the Chinese Communist Party's different forms of subversion, all the different forms of unconventional war. It breaks down war into three different categories: non-military, trans-military, and unconventional military. And here's a quote from it. When we suddenly realize that all these non-war actions may be the new factors constituting future warfare, we have to come up with a new name for this new form of war. Warfare which transcends all boundaries and limits. In short, unrestricted warfare. And what is unrestricted warfare? It's cyber warfare. It's political warfare. It's economic warfare targeting the GDP of countries. It's business warfare targeting individual companies. It's culture warfare, such as the Chinese Communist Party's takeover of Hollywood and use of pressure to censor Hollywood. It's diplomatic warfare. It's drug warfare, such as what I mentioned with the drug cartels. All of these listed openly as part of this strategy. The list could go on and on and on. Who controls the international, what is one of the goals of communism? Seize the means of production. Who controls the GDP products in Australia, right? The iron industry. Who controls, for example, the GDP products in, let's say, most of Latin America? Who controls the GDP products in most of Asia? Who controls the factories, the ability to manufacture, the means of production? Who controls the natural resources? The Chinese Communist Party doesn't already control, they're trying to gain control over it through the One Belt, One Road initiative. And so the Chinese Communist Party is doing this on an extremely large scale, directly guided by its military doctrine and using open systems that happen in plain daylight, operating on American soil as we speak, essentially. The bigger picture of this. Listed here are all the different forms included on the unrestricted warfare system, as well as a few others, such as mimetic warfare, being the idea of how do you manufacture the cultural ideas that go on to influence the culture of a society. But it ties into something the Soviets were doing as well, which they called ideological subversion. There's a great speaker on this. He was a Soviet defector named Yuri Bezmenov. He has some very popular YouTube videos. He's unfortunately no longer with us. But he also wrote a book called Love Letter to America, which I highly recommend. I think it's actually under his pseudonym because he had a pseudonym when he fled to America. Yuri Bezmenov, amazing writer, really warned about a lot of things we're seeing on the surface right now. But the system of, say, subversion that he explained that the Soviet Union at the time was carrying out is the same one the Chinese Communist Party is carrying out. And it happens on 4 stages. First off, there's the demoralization of society, which is you go into a country and you look at all the institutions that make a society function. A society is not just one ideology. Society is not just one race a lot of times. It's not just one culture a lot of times. The larger the society, the more, say, smaller camps you will have of ideology, belief, race, and so on. A society depends on these different camps working together to form a cohesive, say, functioning system. And at different levels, you have different things that support this. You have the churches, you have, the religion, you have trust in the police, you have faith in government, right? The social contract, as some might call it. You have different legal systems, you have institutions, schools, law, you name it. All of these form the, say, basis of a society that make a society function. The process of demoralization is to begin to infiltrate and influence these different institutions and to make people begin to lose faith in them. You want people to start to become hopeless, right? Then you move on to the state of destabilization, which is where you begin to turn these things into, you want them to, if not fully serve the opposite function of what they should, to at the very least become non-functional. So for example, police, right? Law should not be enforced. It should be the evil people who are supported by the police force and not the good people of a society. Police in America, of course, I think most of them are good. Local government officials have tied their hands behind their backs in many parts of the US. That would be, according to this definition, a form of destabilization. For example, providing drugs and hotel rooms to homeless people while American veterans are, have pretty much nothing being done for them, or while the American citizen is having to deal with all these things and, for example, not being able to go to church, but you can go on the street and burn down your community if you want, and the government's going to say it's, A-okay. That would be a form of destabilization, causing people to lose faith in the institution of policing, to cause people to lose faith in the integrity of law within their country. Chinese Communist Party does this openly. Once you destabilize every institution, once you make every single part of that society become either non-functional or make it so it serves a corrupted purpose, the opposite of what's meant to serve, you want to move the society towards open conflict. They want people fighting in the streets. They want people fighting with each other. They want people arguing with each other. All the different camps that make a cohesive society should be turned against each other. This is not just something done by the Soviet Union previously, now the Chinese Communist Party, but something tied to the deeper ideology of communism in general. The idea of the struggle of opposites, class struggle, racial struggle, depending which branch you're going through, all based around this idea. Marx, one of his ideas around this was based on Hegelian dialectic, and the principle was conflict leads forward. If they believed in social Darwinism and they believed in the evolution of societies, then they believed in increasing the conflicts of different camps in order to speed up the social evolution as they saw it, right? This is part of the communist system of doing things. And then finally, you want to create normalization. You cause chaos. You make people panicked. You incite fear. You make them feel that the whole country is going, down the drain. You make them worried about their future. You terrorize them to such an extent that when you want to implement a totalitarian system to deal with the problem you yourself have created, people are grateful for it. And that is the process that they use to subvert a society. Under the Soviet Union, this was the process of exporting the communist revolution. Under the Chinese Communist Party, this is the process of validating and exporting the China model. So that's the bigger picture. Everything we're seeing right now, hopefully explained to at least some extent. Now, that's all for today. We can take questions now.
That was amazing. See what I'm saying? We knew him when? This guy is fantastic. Okay, I'm going to lead off because we don't have a lot of time left, and I know we're eating into your next video that you're going to have to put out there. How much of this it just seems that like what you're talking about is it's completely paralleling this BLM movement. So is there any evidence that the Chinese are working in cahoots with BLM, or maybe the Open Society Foundation, whatever it's called, the Soros stuff? Because they all seem to be working on parallel paths here.
I'd say it's a bit more complicated than that. I mentioned before, Trevor Loudon. He's a contributing author with Epoch Times. He actually wrote a really good breakdown on the movements that are really behind the protests. One of the main ones being the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. There's two different branches of it. And yes, they do have foreign ties, including to terrorist organizations and including to China. I won't break down everything he explained, but yeah, they had a large meetings organizing for all these things ahead of time. They had planning for it ahead of time. They had statements on it ahead of time. And it just so happens that the mass protests in a lot of places that's taking place were organized through front groups of Freedom Road Socialist Organization. One of the main players in what we're seeing take place right now. For them, they view this as a revolution. Black Lives Matter, it's complicated. You do have a lot of individuals who legitimately believe in the cause. They do think they're fighting for racial equality. But you have other ones coming out and saying openly that they're trained Marxists. And yes, they do have connections to a lot of these same organizations. Freedom Road Socialist Organization is tied to not just one thing in and of itself. There's two different branches of it. They had a disagreement. Basically what it was, in the 60s and 70s, when you had all these different communist movements, when the Soviet Union failed, when everything was kind of going away, they consolidated under the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. So a lot of the revolutionary communist groups consolidated under it. And they work openly with, for example, Democratic Socialists of America, Communist Party USA, even the Weathermen. You remember the terrorist group, the Weathermen, communist terrorist group, the Weathermen? They were part of the original movement as well. And so, yeah, and they do also support the global communist revolution. Some of them, they have connections to, designated terrorist organizations doing this kind of stuff. For them, they are talking about open revolution. They regard this as open revolution. And a lot of the protests we're seeing now have, at the very least, some level of coordination directly from these groups.
What is your sense of how aware the Trump administration is of the depth of this effort? And do you have any evidence it is infiltrated as well?
I think now when it comes to forming a political party, I think it's very difficult to make sure every individual in your party is legitimately on your side. And I think Trump has seen that pretty heavily, that many individuals in his camp have kind of, backstabbed him. a lot of them, using means that were later proven false and so on. There are a lot of false accusations against him. And I think also a lot of the media has done a lot of very dishonest reporting on him. As a journalist, I see it every day because I have to go back and, follow their train of information. You find that at the very least, they misrepresent information, at the very least by doing, say, incomplete quotations and things like that, taking information out of context. When it comes to Trump and whether they're aware of this, I do believe they are. Peter Navarro, one of Trump's main advisors on this, is a great guy. He wrote the book Death by China, which actually has a documentary too, if you haven't seen it already. I knew Navarro before he got in, and we weren't like super close, but I interviewed him a few times. He really knows his stuff. A lot of what I just explained to you, Navarro knows about. And so Navarro being on there, I really think that he's helped form Trump's policies around this stuff, and I do think they're aware of it. And as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the different pushes of the whole of, the FBI going after the whole of society threat from these things, talking about, for example, getting every different district attorney's office involved in cases, bringing up cases on this. The Trump administration is going very hard on this right now, and we're seeing it start to hit the surface now.
How would you interpret it, the anticipated collapse of communism in China, and the same time the rising of communism or progressivism in America or Europe? At the same
Personally, I look at patterns, right? Part of my job is to look, I'm an investigative reporter. So the way I view and interpret things is based on anomalies and patterns. And I look at several different things. Now here's what you do. You essentially, to form a pattern, you can do predictive analysis. You look at, say, the different examples of something emerging. Let's say a strange incident takes place, and it may be interesting in and of itself. But if multiple strange incidents are taking place along a certain line, that can show a few different things. It can show, one, maybe a movement starting up, or maybe strings being pulled in the background to possibly create something on the surface, which would, for me as an investigative reporter, for me, that would be a flag up saying, okay, maybe this is something worth investigating. But you can also look at, say, this same analysis to understand social changes. And what are the social changes in the United States? We're seeing, and not just the United States, but around the world, we're seeing really a calling out of the different forms of communist subversion that have been taking place since like the 1940s or even earlier, if you want to go really far back. Really hit the surface in the 1960s, but really weren't really fully called out, mainly because McCarthy was the one running a lot of it, and he was discredited pretty badly. And because really the media was, pretty much all, on its own, saying whatever, its own thing, let's just say it like that. Whereas now you have citizen journalists, now you have social media, now you have direct communication of people. There are ways to communicate and get news and information without going through the main, say, institutions. And so we've seen social phenomena in the US and around the world that are going against communism. And we see the institutions desperately fighting to keep this information from getting out. We see them attacking anybody who dares speak out about it. And people, I think, are increasingly seeing it for what it is, not just in the United States, but in every part of the world. And if you look at the individuals who are becoming influential, you look at the individuals who have a lot of force behind them, it's almost all within these camps. And so when it comes to the trajectory of societies, I think we're seeing right now the death throes of communism. When we look at the protests we see on the streets, a lot of it is just individuals who've been indoctrinated by the media. For most people, their worldview is just shaped by whatever they bring in. Their political views are just going to be shaped by whatever news outlet they watch. A lot of them are a lot more simple than we give them credit, to be honest. And a lot of them are doing these things because they legitimately believe it's the right thing to do based on what they've been told. It doesn't mean they're bad people. You know what I mean? And so when it comes to these protests, really you have, in my eyes at least, maybe 4 different protests. You have the grassroots people who legitimately think they're fighting for something good because the media told them so. You have the, groups who are, in it kind of ideologically, but maybe not too strong. Some of the Black Lives Matter individuals, even some of the groups of, so for example, Democratic Socialists of America. People at the top maybe know what they're doing, people on the bottom probably not. You have opportunists, and you have people, basically gangs coming in and doing looting because it's just an opportunity for them. And then you have individuals who are the ones actually pulling the strings. They say that the snake heads, the ones pulling the body of the snake, essentially. And those are the ones doing the planning. Those are the Antifa types. Those are the ones really going out there and really, when it comes to the real people who really know what they're doing, you're looking at maybe 10,000 people in the U.S. Pulling this whole body along. And it just so happens a lot of the big institutions, including a lot of the media, are just on their side. And so it's painted as being much bigger than it actually is. And individuals, like most people watching this, you have your families, you have your homes, you have your jobs and your businesses. Going out there and protesting, they're going to put your face everywhere. They're going to dox you. They're going to, threaten you or your family. Most people just don't want to deal with that. And so most decent people, the silent majority, is not crazy. They're hanging out at home and they're spending time with their families and having dinner and trying to go on with life as usual. And they're not behaving like, crazies on the street. We also see a different shift, which is on the right. The alt-right has mostly, if not died, at least become irrelevant. We might remember early on there were open conflicts between the alt-right and a lot of these groups. Where are they now? Right? They're forgotten. Nobody even cares about them anymore. And the effect of that is the media can't paint this as a fight between two extremist groups. They can't paint it as this conflict. They can't find their enemy. And so really these groups are going out there and they're making fools of themselves. They're making fools of themselves, and everybody is seeing it. Everybody in the world is seeing them do it. Now they're putting on this big show and they're making a lot of noise, but really I think it's going to have the opposite effect, because I guarantee you not a single person who's already voting for Trump is going to change their votes because they're seeing this. Very likely they're going to become galvanized if they want to go to a Trump rally and they can't even get in to see the guy, they just paid for a plane ticket to go see. It's going to have the opposite effect. And at the same time, in other words, they can block you from seeing Trump. It's going to have the opposite effect. It's going to drive more people to become more animated and more interested in going to the polls and voting because they feel it was a direct attack against them and everything they believe in. And at the same time, a lot of these riots, a lot of the real terrible things we're seeing, increased violence, burning down of stores, looting, it's taking place in the main areas of the voting base of the Democrats mostly. It's taking place in these areas, and oftentimes can only take place if the local government approves of it. If the local government takes a permissive stance on it, where they don't take a strong stance to try to do anything about it. And so people in those communities are saying, for example, here in New York, they're saying, okay, de Blasio, why aren't you doing anything to help us out? And at the same time, he's going after the Jewish communities and things like that. He's going after them. And individuals who might have voted for them feel that they are the ones being attacked now. And they feel the local government no longer supports them. And so what do you do when that happens? Well, very likely you want to go to the polls and vote for the thing against what you see as a threat to yourself. And so I think it's going to have the opposite effect. Personally, with this virus, I know there's different takes on whether it's real or not. I think a lot of conservatives more so don't believe in it. Based on my watching what's happening in China, I think it's very real. At the same time, I do question whether the lockdowns are effective. There are some different reports showing that the crazier restrictive policies being taken might have had the opposite results, that places that had fewer restrictive policies actually were better off. It is unfortunately being politicized. But when it comes to China, they are reeling from it. It is massively affecting them. And affecting them in a way that I don't know if the Chinese Communist Party is going to survive. Personally, I do not believe the Chinese Communist Party is going to survive this. Their economy is decimated. Their support among the grassroots is decimated. They're having infighting even within their own camp, lower officials even criticizing high-level officials. They're having multiple disasters. You have massive, massive flooding in all of southern China right now. You have locusts coming in when they're already having food shortages because of the virus. And then you have this on top of the Hong Kong protests, calling for a break, not just a democracy in Hong Kong, but a breaking away of from the Chinese Communist Party overall. The trajectory of everything we're seeing right now suggests that the Chinese Communist Party, when it comes to their economy, when it comes to their grassroots support, when it comes to their ideological control and the idea that maybe the government can make better decisions than I can, which is used to justify this totalitarian system. All of that is failing. And not only that, but countries, United States, Japan, India, you name it, they're pulling their companies out of China. And the border conflicts with India are making that even more so. The border conflicts with Japan are making that even more so. The CCP, rather than trying to become more friendly, is becoming more hostile, to the extent that even Australia is pulling away from them. Even the European Union is pulling away from them. Even close allies like Iran is openly criticizing them because they said you didn't warn us about this virus and how serious it was, because Iran was actually hit pretty hard by it. And so across the board, the CCP is losing international legitimacy. Across the board, the Chinese economy is being decimated. Across the board, countries are pulling out of China. They're seeing the Chinese Communist Party for what it is. People across the board, this has become a mainstream discussion. Before this virus, I was talking about this stuff, but it was not a mainstream discussion. So across the board now, we're seeing this. And I don't think it's going to survive, to be honest.
That's the best news ever.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Very informative. We knew him when?